Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mentoring Diaries. I'm your host, Dr. Tuba Ansari, and I'm delighted to have you with us. When people think about supply chains, they often picture logistic, procurement, warehouses, transportation, planning, technology, and operational efficiency. It's a profession known for solving complex business challenges and keeping the world moving. But behind every successful supply chain is something even more powerful: people. The leaders who inspire teams through uncertainty, the professionals who collaborate across cultures and functions, the mentors who share their experience so others can grow faster and lead better. Today's episode is exactly about the same. We're exploring the human side of supply chain, why mentoring matters. Joining me today is someone who spent years leading, influencing, and developing talents within the supply chain profession. We'll discuss why mentoring is no longer a nice to have, rather, a strategic capability for organizations that want resilient teams and future ready leaders. Welcome to the podcast, Hazel. It's wonderful to have you with us. We would like you to introduce yourself, via the mentoring lens.
Thank you, Tuba, and thank you for having me. I'm Hazel Annikin. I've spent the last 3 decades in operations and supply chain leadership, but also sustainability, mostly inside European and global supply chains in big organizations. And I think to the mentoring angle, early on in management, I realized that I guess the hardest problems that I was solving weren't about process or systems or customs. It was about people, how they think, how they lead under pressure, how they communicate, whether they had someone in their corner trying to find their potential. And I think this experience and also the experience I had as being a mentee myself led me into mentoring. And I think in the beginning it was quite intuitively, ad hoc people would ask me to mentor people in their teams, and then subsequently training as a mentor and a coach, as I really wanted to build more professional skills on how I was doing that. And that led me to today, where now I run Pathfinder as a supply chain leadership development and advisory practice. And I'll also soon have the delight of hosting a supply chain podcast, Let's Talk Supply Chain. So new adventures, and really helped by mentoring.
That's great and wonderful to know about the kind of experience, the background, that we're gonna have with us today and the kind of discussion that we'll have around that. Let's begin with something fundamental. Supply chains are often associated with processes, system, and efficiency, yet every process is ultimately driven by people. So from your perspective, what do organizations often overlook about the human side of supply chain leadership?
Yeah, I think it's a great point on processes, flows, and how people have that perception. I think what people don't often realize is behind those numbers, people are making judgment calls under pressure, often with incomplete information, whether that's getting the salmon on your plate in a restaurant, or the clothes you buy in a store, or the things you buy with one click. There's so many things that interact behind the scenes which require humans, and that has such an impact for supply chain leadership on both the employee journey and the customer journey. And even if people don't have supply chain in their job title, someone like an HR professional in a logistics company has a critical role to play. And I think to your point on what's overlooked, I think supply chain leaders regularly make decisions that don't impact their own workforce. The effect of a decision amplifies across the whole supply chain, which is, an extra responsibility, I think, for supply chain leaders.
Every leader has people who influence their journey. So, throughout your own career, how has mentoring shaped your growth, not only as a supply chain professional, but also as a leader?
I love this question, Tuva. Thank you for asking it. I had so many great leaders, especially in my early days in supply chain, who really gave me that space and the confidence to grow. And I think different mentors at different stages with their unique flavors, unique perspectives. And I had people who, to your point on leadership, had some very specific roles in my growth and development, where they identified a gap that maybe would stop me progressing. For example, I was very shy about speaking in public. It was just
Very good.
mildly terrifying. It's still scary, of course. However, I had a really great mentor who identified that and would work with me and give me different opportunities, different ways to practice, also explore different ways that could suit me. And I went from really barely being able to speak in front of 5 people into being able to present at conferences, which for me was a great gift to have that mentorship.
Many professionals enter leadership because they're technically excellent, but technical expertise and leadership aren't necessarily the same thing, as we all know. So, how does mentoring help professionals evolve from operational experts into influential leaders who can inspire, develop, and empower others?
Yeah, and I think also I like your question on how do we go from operational expert. I think we shouldn't underestimate what it takes to be an operational expert because those people really add value across the supply chain. However, when we think about being an influential leader, um, I think mentoring helps people stay their authentic self and develop a broader set of toolkit of skills. I think a good mentor brings their own perspectives and experience. In my case, a lot of anecdotes and stories, like storytelling. Um, However, I think where the value is also holding up that mirror, helping leaders see their blind spots, develop their talents, thinking about how they communicate. And I think it also helps them more consciously manage their own impact and development.
We're seeing this increasing interest in group mentoring across organization. So, for those who may be hearing the term for the first time, how does group mentoring differ from traditional one-to-one mentoring, and why is it particularly valuable in supply chain environments?
Yeah, I think one-to-one mentoring is great and it's had its place, it's part of the ecosystem because it goes really deep on individuals' particular situation. However, what I think is great in group mentoring is that power of peers. Quite often people realize, sometimes with relief, they're not the only one wrestling with a particular challenge. And I think in a well-run cohort, a group mentoring is a high trust space where people learn together guided them by the mentor. And I think there's an additional accountability between the sessions because of that peer-to-peer talking, exchanging, and often some things surface which might be not applicable in a one-to-one relationship. I give an example. Maybe somebody in the room shares a topic, which leads to someone else sharing, adding a perspective, asking a question, and all this builds on a more 360 perspective on the situation. And I think that helps people see things from other people's perspectives without judgment.
Definitely.
I think that's a real flavor.
Supply chain professional, I mean, they hardly work in isolation. So I think that's where group mentoring actually, makes a lot of difference for them, as they're constantly collaborating across procurement, logistics, manufacturing, planning, finance. And there are so many things that they have to do. Plus, over and above that, there's also a cross-culture thing that comes in place. So how can group mentoring strengthen collaboration, encourage knowledge sharing, and help break down organizational silos?
Yeah, I think as you say to it, it goes across so many functions. And I think what's great is when you put people in the same cohort, they quickly realize that even if they don't share the same function or job title, a lot of their challenges resonate. And I think the peer accountability quite often naturally erodes some of the us and them thinking that you typically sometimes see in organization. I often talk about the boundaries of who are the we, who are the they, because when somebody becomes a we, it creates a lot more empathy and changes your perspective about what they're doing. If I speak to my marketing colleague and say my marketing colleague as opposed to them, it's quite a different frame. And the other thing to that point you mentioned about cross cultures, cross functions, is it builds a shared language for change, which I think in particular in these times where we see disruption and change, you can really, in particular past functions, geographies, that shared language is really critical to organization success.
One challenge leaders often mention is time. So operational environments move incredibly fast, and mentoring sometimes feels like an additional responsibility, for them. So how can organization make mentoring part of everyday leadership instead of treating it as another program or an initiative?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think mentoring doesn't need a big time commitment. That's kind of a perception. I think it can really live within existing meetings, team huddles, one-to-ones, rather than being, as you say, bolted on as a separate initiative. And I think that's the same with any continuous improvement or sustainability initiative. It has to live and breathe and be part of the mindset and not seen as a chore. I often talk about building muscle memory when you want to make something stick. And I think organizations that build it into how they operate, they get much more return on impact in terms of the investment of time. It becomes a habit, a muscle that you're using, and not sort of a one-off event that you kind of have to squeeze in. And also, I think in terms of embedding in organizations, things like reverse mentoring is also very impactful especially to build empathy across generations and really keep leaders agile, and that structure that we said about, time is always what you put the stones in the jar and how you make that happen. And I think when people have got that time commitment, it helps the leaders show up. A simple thing is look at your diary, see how much time you spend on strategy, how much on development, and how much operational noise there is. And I think it can help reflect on, is that balance appropriate for your role and the leader that you want to be and the impact you want to have?
Let's talk about mentors themselves. What qualities truly make someone an effective mentor in supply chain and operations? Is deep technical expertise enough, or are there leadership qualities that matter even more?
I think to that point, the technical credibility has its place, and I think people really respect the knowledge. When you can sit with someone that you're like, this person gets how the work works. They're not talking theoretically. They understand my world. However, I think in terms of qualities, it's curiosity, active listening, humility, and I think asking good questions while trying to leave judgment and assumptions at the door is really what makes the difference. Where I think the best mentors create compassionately that space that makes people be safe enough to say what's not working. And that's psychological safety, not so much technical skill. And really showing, I guess, respect for the mentees and their experience and their context. And that leads me to the last quality that I think is important, which is, I would say, self-awareness as much as subject knowledge. A group mentoring we were talking about earlier, it can be tricky. There can be quite a lot of moving parts, and a mentor who stays steady under pressure and navigates that is also modeling some of the behaviors they're trying to develop and knowing how to switch the role. Do you share experience? Do you listen, ask more questions, and explore the mentee situation? I think is really what makes the difference.
Definitely. And to add to that, real stories often bring these ideas to life. So, without mentioning any specific organization, could you please share an example where mentoring or perhaps group mentoring helped transform collaboration, improve team performance, or unlock leadership potential?
One of my recent mentoring cohorts, it's a recent example. We had a cohort on storytelling and selling, how to bring that. And one of the participants in that cohort was really struggling, with the need to communicate to difficult stakeholders. And they were falling into a little bit of a, let's say, a disheartened, disappointed cycle, feeling like maybe I'm not cut out for this role, maybe something's happening here. And what was really great in that situation is we explored different tools and methods, which then, to your point, real situations, then the people putting that into practice, how to feel more confident, how to feel more calm, take a step back, read the room and the situation. And what struck me in this example was the empathy and understanding from the other participants and kind of being in this person's corner, and also the collective learning because this person shared so openly. Because I think that openness to learning and change is really important. And in this case, this person, it was a joy to see how they evolved from being almost afraid to speak to this stakeholder to manage a really tricky situation and then share their success and learnings with the group. And I think being able to see that that person can then see they had some potential in themselves that they couldn't quite see on their own. And through that experience, it was yeah, really a pleasure to be part of, let's say.
I've often seen organizations, invest heavily in technical trainings, coaching, leadership development. Where does group mentoring fit within that broader leadership ecosystem? And how does it complement this, other development approaches that we see around?
I love the fact, Tuba, that you call it an ecosystem because that's something that I like a lot to think of. I talk a lot about recipes and toolkits, ingredients that are building that up. And I think, in terms of investment, I think formal training is great. It builds on the knowledge. How do you do something? Fine. Coaching really evolves that individual specific situation. And I think group mentoring sits in between. It's blending expert guidance with peer learning. It's more scalable than coaching and more personal than, I guess, traditional classroom training. And I think it's very complementary to those formal trainings, bringing maybe new ingredients, new possibilities to develop that training. And I think learning is not so much linear. People are on different paths as employees, as humans, as leaders. And I think mentoring is where to our earlier point, is it gets tested against real situations and real problems. That's the value of being able to bring it to life. And I think, we do some one of the programs I do is leading change and transitioning to new world. And there we use really real life examples. And then it's the work that happens in between that real life experience, as we're saying, that people get to exchange really practically on what they've learned. So I think it's highly complementary. And I think it also creates long-term empowerment so that people can use those skills long after the group mentoring is completed.
I would like to finish this with a broader perspective. Imagine every supply chain leader made a commitment to mentor just one person, I mean, or perhaps one team. What kind of long-term impact could that have on individual, organization, and ultimately the future of supply chain profession?
The dream, Tuba, the dream. The effect would be such an amplifier. One mentored leader mentors the next, and I think the profession can really evolve from being seen as a bit operational into a genuine leadership culture. And I think take away some of the idea that it's just for the chosen few. Everyone can choose to learn and adapt. And I think for organizations, in terms of the long-term impact, I think it builds a more resilient leadership pipeline. You can ideally grow from within. And also to the earlier point on taking away barriers, it builds trust and collaboration and knowledge sharing. And I think those leaders, if everyone mentored one person, they can make more conscious, informed choices and decisions. And as someone who's passionate about the profession, I like to think it would reframe a little bit supply chain leadership as more something that people aspire towards rather than maybe quite often fall into.
I think also it creates a ripple effect, because eventually they will
Yeah,
follow and
completely.
mentor people, and we'll see that change coming in. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for that, Hazel. Now we'll quickly move to my favorite part, and that's the far side round. So, whatever comes to your mind, just like one word kind of a thing. So, if you could mentor your younger self on your very first day in supply chain, what would you say?
Stay curious. You'll never have all the questions. Just keep asking questions. You'll never have all the answers, sorry. Just keep asking questions.
Great mentoring is.
Listening long enough to ask thoughtful questions and not rushing to give the right answer or solution so that people can discover possibilities and their own answers.
What's one question every leader should ask themselves more often?
Oh, one question. What is the focus for developing myself and my team right now, and what would my team say?
What's one misconception about supply chain leadership that you would love to change?
That it's a boring back office technical function, when in reality it's one of the most human-centric, cross-functional and fun leadership functions.
And finally, what does mentoring mean to you?
Mentoring is walking alongside someone as a thinking partner until they find clarity in their own leadership. And I think it's also quietly believing in someone's potential until they can see it for themselves.
Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your experience and insight, Hazel. One of the biggest takeaways from today's conversation is that while supply chains are built on system, they succeed because of people. Mentoring is more than developing individual career. It's about strengthening collaboration, preserving knowledge, building future leaders, and creating organizations that are resilient enough to thrive through change. To everyone listening, I encourage you to reflect to one simple question. Who are you helping grow? Because leadership isn't only measured by the results we deliver today, it's also measured by the leaders we help create for tomorrow. Thank you for listening. I'm Dr. Tuba Ansari, and I'll see you in the next conversation. Until then, keep learning, keep leading, and most importantly, keep mentoring.